Okay, we'll get started. Good afternoon. How's everyone doing? Well, there was a lot of discussion about Palo Alto Networks products. Hope you are enjoying all the conference content so far. Great. Before we get into the details, I'd like to ask several questions so I can understand the audience today. So how many of you are responsible for managing data for your company? Please raise your hand. About half. Well, it's a tough job. We all realized there was a lot of consistent work to manage the data. It's much, much more complicated than just set up systems and rack up the server, right? Well, the next question, how many of you are actually consuming SIEM or logging solution like that? Raise your hands, please. OK, looks like all the people managing data are using SIEM. So we're in the same boat. We always ask ourselves, how can we bridge all the awesome technology out there and make the SIEM and make it continuously valuable to what you're doing today? Well, this is what we're going to focus on the session today. Before we can get into the details, I'd like to quickly introduce who we are and what our role is. All right, let's see this works.
It's not working.
Yeah. Oh. Well, we realized yesterday there were a lot of rooms really dark, so we put really large pictures last minute and to make sure you can see us. And my name is Guang. I have been with Palo Alto Networks for 3.5 years. I'm with a great team of engineers at Palo Alto Networks information security team to focus on security tools development, security automation, and data engineering. Here today with me is my colleague Anuj.
Hey guys, my name is Anuj Karnik, and I work for the information security team at Palo Alto Networks. My background is managing and administering SIEM tools and log management solutions.
Awesome, thanks Anuj. All right. Well, the mission of our security team at Palo Alto Networks is to secure the enterprise, secure the cloud, and secure the future, right? I learned that yesterday during the keynote. And actually, it matched perfectly about the mission internally with our internal teams. It's actually, you probably can imagine, right? As an internal information security team, we are one of the largest customers of our company for very good reasons, right? We're always asking ourselves, how can we make our product better and leveraging all the technology to help our security mission? Today, we will focus on several areas. I'm going to quickly talk about data management, very high level and our philosophy. Then we will spend most of the session today to deep dive what we learned last several years and focus on separate specific areas. For example, how to manage the data generated from Palo Alto Networks products. How can you leverage the API of our product to make your life better and easier to bridge the technology together and bridge the gap? And at the end of the session, we will have about 5 to 10 minutes to address your questions. All right, let's get into it. So data management. Data is the essential elements of your company. There's nearly everything you do at your company depends on the data. So to have a very solid data management program is the foundation. So secure the foundation. You need to have a properly process to collect and distribute and enrich the data and normalize them in the right way so that you can ensure the reliability, accessibility for your data services. And last, deliver them in timely manner. So at Palo Alto Networks, there are many teams depending on the data we provide and manage. InfoSec, IT, DevOps, right? We support the functionality all the way from compliance, reporting, operation troubleshooting, all the way to data science and security operations. All of these services requires work, and the request to us about onboarding new logs, building dashboards, never stop coming. So what we can do about them, right? That's part of the life, but we can do something to make it better. There are several areas I think you can think about, I can think about as well. First, define a strategy, right? So making sure you have a properly evaluated risk assessment about your work. For example, are the data are from production environment or QA environment? Are the data supporting the visibility into authentication authorization? Are the data are coming from a product which is going to go live very soon? Asking those questions in your process to make sure you evaluate them to properly prioritize. From technology point of view, think about leveraging cloud for your infrastructure of your logging solutions. Or even better, thinking about leveraging a cloud security solution which can take care of your data management challenge while supplying with a lot of security benefits with it, right? And third, automation. Is there any day-to-day work or your workflow process in your data engineering team can leverage automation to help improve efficiency and minimize the risk or damage of your data loss if that ever happens? Well, that's a lot to think about already, but with all the consideration, there's one more key point which we believe will impact a lot of your decision, how you can design your data management solution, how you can make it better. Can you squeeze more value out of your data? Can you squeeze more value out of the large data sets you're collecting in your SIEM? Well, follow that. Can you even make your SIEM much more valuable compared to today? Right? For example, the firewall traffic log as an example, it's really large data sets. It consumes a large portion of your SIEM license. But are you satisfied just dumping them into your search and indexing engine? Can you build machine learning model and make them better, like detecting behaviors which is anomalies? Can you automatically correlate your traffic log with your endpoint log with all the other awesome data automatically and fast? Right, there's a lot of things to think about. We have been thinking about these questions for a long time. I still remember 10 years ago, when I was at my previous company, my colleagues and I found out, oh, Hadoop is really cool. Why don't we set up a Hadoop cluster and dump all the data over there, right? Start writing the MapReduce job and build a machine learning model with ambitious to challenge the traditional world of SIEM to make the correlation even better. Or at least we can complement SIEM for the static rule-based detection with the dynamic nature of machine learning technologies. Well, you probably know the answer is hard. It's really hard to accomplish. Well, 10 years later, I think our company come with a good solution, Cortex. This makes us in a much better position compared to 10 years ago. With all the data that we natively collected from networking endpoint and enables Cortex XDR, a lot of questions I just asked, you can get answer for them. Machine learning, correlation, automatic response to your alerts in XDR. I keep that there in your mind as thoughts. Right today, why don't we do this? We will use two very basic but most important aspects of your data management program, data acquisition and log health monitoring, to share some lights about how we are thinking at Palo Alto Networks to bridge these technologies together, to leverage the API and automation to make your life better and bridge the technology even further. With that, I will invite my colleague back to the stage.
Thanks, Guang. Thanks for highlighting some of the aspects of our data management program, right? What I'd like to do is go into some details about how we ingest and acquire the data that is generated by all of our Palo Alto Networks products that we use internally. Like Guang mentioned, right? We are one of our biggest internal first customers, and so we end up ingesting and having to manage a lot of this data. So what I'm going to do is share some of our experiences, best practices, tips and tricks, and essentially share our experience in how we're doing it, and if you can take away some of those key tricks, right? So I'm going to talk about some of our products that we are using internally. I've broken them down into 4 major categories, and you may not have seen them broken down into these 4 categories. I'm classifying them in these 4 categories based on the default logging options available with these products. as well as how we are ingesting that data and how we are using that data and how we are maximizing the value out of that data. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the Prisma Public Cloud, which was formerly RedLock. It's a SaaS solution that helps you protect your public cloud, so GCP, AWS, Azure, right? And it will catch misconfigurations, it will catch if there's any malicious activity and send you security alerts based on that. So there's a couple of different ways in which you can consume this data that is generated in the product into your SIEM. The way we are doing it is using HTTP event forwarding. For those of you who may not be familiar with the HTTP event forwarding logging, it's similar to syslog, but it adds a component of authentication so that you're using a token to authenticate that channel, and then the data starts flowing. So that's what we are using. Internally, we use Splunk as our SIEM. So Splunk has a feature called HTTP event collectors, and we are essentially using that to collect that data. To do this, you'll have to have your receivers reachable publicly, and you'll have to use a publicly signed cert to set up a TLS connection. And once you have that, you can essentially set up the data flow. And then the data is going to be in JSON log format, so it's really easy to parse it down into key value pairs. The next one I'm going to talk about is Prisma SaaS, which was formerly known as Aperture. Again, it's a SaaS solution. It's a CASB tool that lets you protect your SaaS applications. So ServiceNow, Salesforce, G Suite, Box, right? You can, again, catch policy violations. It has a DLP engine that will send you security alerts. And so that's the kind of the data that you can expect out of it. Again, it has a couple of different ways in which you can consume that data into your SIEM. We're using the API that's available, so you can query the API and pull down the logs. Again, if you're using Splunk, there's a Palo Alto Networks add-on on the Splunk App Store. It's really easy. You just plug in your API credentials, and you can start ingesting the data. It has an option to forward syslog as well, but that essentially becomes a push technique as opposed to a pull technique with the API, and we generally prefer to use the pull technique. So that's the thing that we're using. And again, it has JSON log format, so it's really easy to parse it out into key value formats. The third one that I want to talk about is 3 products, Traps Management Service, Cortex XDR, and Prisma Access, which was formerly GPCS. Again, all 3 by default log to the Cortex Data Lake. So Traps Management Service and GPCS will send their logs to the Cortex Data Lake. Cortex XDR, which is part of the Cortex suite, operates on that data. Like Guang mentioned, right, has machine learning algorithms for correlation searches, and any alerts it generates, it sends it back to the Cortex Data Lake. So it's going to log all of that data to the Cortex Data Lake by default. But if you want to ingest that data into your SIEM, there are options available. So there's a log forwarding app on the Cortex hub that you can use to forward that data down. Again, you'll need receivers that are reachable publicly with a publicly signed cert so that you can set up a TLS connection, and that will essentially help you start receiving this data. And then the only difference over here is this is a CSV format as opposed to the JSON format with the previous ones. This essentially brings us to the big ones, right? The next-gen firewalls. I'm going to cover some content on the next-gen firewalls. It should be the same for if it's an on-premise device or a VM series firewall. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to talk about a few different types of logs that are generated, or a few different types of data that's generated in the next-gen firewalls for a minute here. The traffic logs by far are the biggest volume logs that come out of your firewalls. It's essentially a record of all of the traffic that's traversing your firewall or hitting your firewall. Is generated by all of your firewall policies, right? The threat logs are generated by any threat modules you may have activated. So wildfire, URL filtering, that sort of thing. Those logs are generated in the threat logs. System logs are, again, logs relevant to your firewall system. Your VPN connections, if you're using your firewalls to host a global protect gateway, all of those GP authentication logs are going to be in that log type. And then your config logs help you essentially audit the logs. This isn't an exhaustive list. There are other log types, but these are the major ones that you'll generally care about. So there's a few different ways in which you can consume this data that's generated from the next-gen firewalls. I'm going to cover all of the different options available, and then I'm going to touch upon what are we using to essentially maximize the value out of this data, right? So I'm going to focus on the left half first. If you have a large number of firewalls in your environment, you're probably using Panorama to manage all of those devices, right? And so Panorama becomes a really good destination for your logs. Panorama has a really good UI that you can use to interact and search your logs and stuff like that. Now with Cortex Data Lake, you can send your logs to the Cortex Data Lake as well. This is an either or. You can choose either destinations, or you can choose to dual feed both destinations. And then you can still use your Panorama UI to search for those logs. Panorama is smart enough to search both destinations and dedupe the result and show you the result. And then the third thing that I want to mention is there's an Explore app on the Cortex Hub. So if you're sending your logs to the Cortex Data Lake, there's an app on the Cortex Hub as well that you can essentially use to interact with the data and search the logs. A few things that I want to highlight over here if you're going to end up using the Cortex Data Lake is you'll be configuring it through the device tab or through the Panorama templates. But essentially, if you go to Setup Management and scroll all the way down, there's a logging service section. Once you have all of your licenses and your entitlements, you can essentially start configuring this. You'll be checking the first box, or you'll be checking the second box if you want to feed both of your destinations. What I want to highlight over here is the third option, the enhanced application logging. Like we've said before, right? Once you send your logs to the Cortex Data Lake, there's going to be machine learning algorithms in Cortex XDR that help you correlate that data. Checking this option gives those algorithms much more to chew on, and so that's something that we highly recommend is selecting that option. And then the one other thing that you want to make sure is in the objects, you want to go to your log forwarding section and create a log forwarding profile. Make sure all of your log subtypes are selected for the logging service. That will make sure that all of your logs are effectively ending up in the Cortex Data Lake. The second option is obviously sending your logs to your SIEM, right? And if you guys are already doing that, this is a pretty standard, pretty straightforward way that the firewalls have to send logs to a syslog destination. It's really simple and straightforward. Go to the server profiles and create a syslog profile. Plug in your destination, plug in your port if you want to use the default 514 port. Just make sure that you're using TCP instead of UDP. That's generally the recommendation that we have with this. So having looked at all of the options that we have available for logging, what we realized was there was a challenge that we were facing with the traffic logs, right? And I'm going to focus a little bit just on the traffic logs for a minute here, and not the rest of the log types. I'm going to talk about just the traffic logs. There's a big challenge with the traffic logs because it's a really large log volume. What we've noticed is traffic logs are generally 85 to 90% of all of the logs coming out of your firewalls. If you're sending this data to your SIEM, it's probably around 50% of all logs ending up in your SIEM. And that's driving a lot of considerations, right? There's a cost consideration, there's storage considerations. You might have to hold that data for a certain number of days, and these logs become a big factor in those calculations. These logs also become a factor when you start thinking about your performance with your search and indexing capabilities in your SIEM, if you're sending those logs to your SIEM. And the traffic logs are really useful, have a really rich detail in all of the content that they have. But if you're not really using all of that content in your SIEM, it's a little bit of an overkill, and it'll take up a lot of your resources, right? And so what we ended up doing was we're kind of using a hybrid approach where we're sending the original raw log to our Cortex Data Lake, and then we're sending an aggregated feed to our SIEM. So what do I mean when I say aggregated or a log aggregation, right? So there's two aspects to this. This is essentially an example of the traffic log. I don't know if you can see the red highlighted fields here. But when we looked at our use cases in our SIEM, what we realized was, for the most part, we just ended up using the 15 fields that we have highlighted over here in our SIEM. The traffic log, like I said, right, really good detail, 60 plus fields. But in our SIEM, we ended up just using about 15 of these fields for pretty much all of the use cases we had in our SIEM. They included IPs, NATed IPs, ports, protocols, what was the user action app, what was the firewall device, zones, profiles, rules. But that was pretty much it. These were the 15 fields that we always ended up using in our SIEM. And so we realized we could probably shrink the log down to just these 15 fields and still get the same value. The second thing that we realized was all of the traffic that was traversing our firewall was fairly repetitive, was fairly, and so the data that was in the traffic logs was fairly redundant, right? What do I mean by that? So if server A is talking to server B about 125 times a minute, for the most part, these 15 fields are going to have the same value. The rest of the stuff might change, but these 15 fields will always have the same value. And so if we can aggregate the log once a minute, we are still holding on to the relevant values of these fields, but we can probably just add an event count, and this is probably all I need in my SIEM to satisfy all of the use cases that I have in my SIEM. And so when we looked at our use case coverage, what we realized was Cortex was able to help us with a lot of our ad hoc searching for troubleshooting and stuff like that. It was actually doing a better job with the cross-correlation with our Palo Alto products, given that Cortex XDR now has much better correlation capabilities, right? It's much easier to have Cortex XDR than build our own manual correlation use cases. And the aggregated feed in our SIEM still helped us satisfy all of the use cases that we had with our SIEM. So what did it mean by doing this? What did we gain? What is the benefit out of this, right? So like I said, two aspects to it, right? When we just reduced our fields to 15 fields, we were able to shrink down the original raw log to 1/3 of the original size. Aggregating it once a minute, we were able to shrink it down to 1/5 of the original size. Both of these essentially combined to shrink our original raw logs to less than 1/10 of our original logs, right? So that's what we gained. That was the big benefit, is if we can satisfy all of the use cases in our SIEM using the traffic logs, using just 1/10 of the original raw logs, that was the big benefit for us. So before I close out the data ingestion part, I want to share some of the best practices. The first one might be fairly obvious, but make sure all of your firewalls are configured with the same time zone uniformly across all of your firewalls, preferably UTC, because if you have one firewall in Sydney, one in London, and if there's an event that happens 2 seconds apart from each other and they're logging in their local time zones, it's going to appear as if it happened 12 hours apart from each other. So make sure that you're using the same time zone across all firewalls. Configure your log receivers in some sort of an HA or a load balanced mode. That way, if your receiver falls over at 2 a.m., you aren't scrambling at 2:30 trying to fix the problem or even figure out what the problem is, right? Ensure role-based access control. This is a big one because there's a lot of the data that you're dealing over here that's security relevant data, that's security sensitive. You don't want everyone to have access to this data. So make sure that you're configuring role-based access control. And then the last one is make sure all of your firewalls are configured to log. In fact, all of the other data acquisition that we discussed, make sure it's configured to log correctly and have an ongoing audit policy or a way to check that whatever you configured is still logging and is still sending you all of the relevant data. And I'm going to have Guang come back and talk to you about that point in a little more detail.
Thanks, Anuj. To quickly recap, what Anuj was showing you guys is how we can manage the data efficiently. And the most important part is the mindset. You can be really creative according to your internal requirements and use cases, right? For the next several minutes, I'd like to leverage this opportunity to also show another mindset. You can leverage the APIs and automation orchestration platforms to help you improve the efficiency, response to your incident, response to your day-to-day work much better. So firewall log health. There are several data sources you need to consider firewall log health, right? So it's very straightforward. Number one is the firewall and panorama. So for all the important settings that Anuj was pointing out earlier in the screenshot, the logging service checkbox, enhanced application logging, those configurations can be pulled via API calls. Second, the Cortex Data Lake. You want to gain visibility into your data lake because you configure it. You want to know how many of them reaching the destination. Is there any issues between your source and the destination? Last, let's don't forget about our on-prem systems and SIEM. We want to know their system health, CPU memory, and the data health itself, which is still going to your SIEM. With all of these data, it can go to a very good system of your own choice. Here, we are demonstrating an idea how you can leverage a Demisto system, which is our automation and orchestration platform, to help you achieve the goal. So you probably hear a lot about Demisto during this whole conference, right? It's great for security use cases, great for building and response for your SOC team. However, from a developer point of view, right, I am been doing automation for a long time. By using the Demisto system, it provides a lot of benefits even for developers. First, the video editor is really helpful to help building a use cases really fast in a very, very good manner. Second, Demisto help you manage the API, manage the relationship with your vendors or products internally. What I mean by that, if the API change, Demisto will help update them. So you don't have to worry about changing the foundation of your automation process. Last but not least, sometimes your engineer leaves, right? So your code and knowledge leave with them. Demisto, the playbook, serves as two purposes, implementation and documentation. The knowledge stay with your team much better and longer time. With all the data Demisto can gather from these systems, you can actually build a dashboard and gain visibility into them and from the database your choice. So let's quickly talk about Panorama APIs. What I would like to do is not talk about how to generate API keys and how to make XML API calls. What I'd like to tell you is how we have been struggling before and figure out how to point to the specific configuration where the XML pass. These tips and tools will help you get there. First one is API browser. So with API browser, as long as you add the /API part after your domain IP of your Panorama firewall, you'll be able to load a web page like this one. Listed all the available commands. If you drill down to each individual link here, it will help you figure out where is the configuration you want to hit, what the command you're looking for. With the latest upgrade of 9.0, we're supporting REST API as well. If your firewall is that version above, you can add /REST API-doc to load a great documentation to show you what is available through the API process here. And this one, we're demonstrating how you can generate an API key very easily. Well, debug console. If you never use debug console, it's really good too. And if you're a web developer, looks really similar to that too. The way to use it is, first of all, you authenticate to your console and use another tab, load a /debug link there, and it will load a view like right-hand side. What it will does is every single call you make on the UI will show up all the corresponding XML paths. It will help you figure out what is exactly XPath for your API. To summarize everything, first of all, you need to know your visibility, or your scope as well. What is the whole world of your firewall, right? How many firewall you're managing? Through API call like this one, you will be able to list all the firewall in your environment. The reason I'm listing here is probably save you some time if you want to do the same when you're trying to figure out the command. So the ops command takes the format of a command called like the XML format. With that information, it can provide the name of the firewall, serial number, the peer serial number, which means they are HA pairs, and all the great details. Next one, for the example that Anuj was showing there, for the server profile, syslog profile, you will be able to pull through this API call to know which destination your firewall is sending to your on-prem SIEM. For the syslog logging, which is for the system logging, which is including system, global protect, config, all those details, we're including both the Cortex Data Lake and on-prem SIEM configuration. All of these can be pulled from here. As you can see, the style is a little bit different. This one is XPath. The XPath is /slack and shared. And these are very useful information to know when you're trying to gain visibility in individual firewall. Well, another point I want to point out here, the target parameter here. Well, we still like to know individual firewall, they are being configured in the right way. If there's anything misconfigured, we want to know individually. Even if Panorama managing the profile consistently across your organization, this is a double check. Last one here is log forwarding. Traffic, threats, URL. All of the configurations can be pulled from this URL. Well, with all of these ingredients figured out, Demisto has native integration with PAN-OS. Well, because Demisto is building for SOC use cases, for operational use cases like this one, we figure out the URL call ourselves. Then the next step is very simple. You just leverage the command called Panorama and run anything supported through the API. This will make it a great component that you can reuse for any security use cases or operational use cases in your playbook. Next, really quick about the data lake. So how can you gain visibility in the data lake? Currently, our current version of Cortex Data Lake, you can grab a lot of information through summary log. Summary log is 15-minute window of aggregation of all the predefined aggregated data fields like source, destination, IP. Similar concept of our log aggregation sauce there. So with traffic sum, which is traffic log summary, threat sum, threat log summary, you can actually gain a stream of data, which is much lower volume compared to raw log, right? And to know which firewall is sending to data lake, what kind of type of log is being sent into data lake. With summary log is also supported by SQL style query. And these queries can be wrapped in our Python SDK. And the documentation of that SDK is detailed from here. This is the current version. And this is just showing an idea. You can build a dashboard like the one on the right-hand side. Another point I want to call out as well is Demisto will have integration with Cortex as well. And for the current use cases, they're supporting more of security incident response by pulling the predefined event services alert so that you know what is going on in the data sets you send to Cortex. For anything that the current integration between Demisto and PAN-OS and Cortex it doesn't support, it's very, very easy to build your customized iSet within Demisto. By even modify this one, this is a button actually showing all the code behind this integration. So I strongly recommend if you haven't checked out the details of Demisto, go to the booth in the Expo, and you will see how Demisto works. Well, let's pull everything together as a quick use cases. Demisto will be triggered by alerts, for example, a firewall missing traffic log. And a series of actions will be performed by the playbooks. You can call Panorama to see that specific firewall, what the configuration of that specific source type. Is it changed? Next, you can query Cortex and your on-prem SIEM to see whether the traffic is being blocked from source to destination. With all the information, you send it over to your team for collaboration to make a judgment about your next steps, or again, approval for your changes. Sending a ServiceNow ticket to the owner of the system to fix the issue, or even better, right? When the change is very simple, very low risk, like checking the box of logging service, why don't we just make an API call to fix them? As you can see, Demisto is such a powerful yet very useful tool for even operational use cases. The last tip I want to share here is optimize your design, because your process can be really big. The playbook can easily go growing bigger and bigger. I can even make this one even larger. You probably cannot see anything here. But the point here is break them down. Break them down to the module that you can reuse. Break down to the module that brings value to other team members as well. This will also help you do QA testing. All the workflow testing in Demisto is very easy, nice. With breaking down to individual playbooks like this one, you will be able to know which part of the playbook having problems. You can identify the issues really quick. Well, demonstration here, you can pull all the firewall settings very easily, 3 steps, with the API call we defined, and you can compare them and find out is there any anomalies, right? So with content of that, that is all we want to share today. So 3 parts. The quickly mindset about how you can manage your data management program, how you can manage the data generated from Palo Alto Networks firewall, and how can you be creative to fit your own needs when you're dealing with large amount of data sets. Last but not least, how you can leverage the API and automation to make your life better. I hope one or some of these the information here we're sharing today, you can take it back and improve your life. Thank you.